Welcome to Chapter 19, The Growing Pains of Urbanization from 1870 to 1900. Growth is a good thing, except when it's unplanned. That's what the United States experienced in this time period that we're talking about between 1870 and 1900. With technology innovations like steam power and electricity, production skyrocketed, and suddenly, very suddenly, with this new production came new demands, like the immediate need for more factory workers. Many of these factory workers came from the rural areas of the United States, people moving into the big factory towns for work. But still more hands were needed. Immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe began to flood into the United States through the New York City harbor, where they were greeted by the Statue of Liberty, a symbol for freedom and opportunity. So for millions of immigrants arriving by ship in New York City's harbor, the sight of the Statue of Liberty, as in unveiling the Statue of Liberty, this painting from 1886 by Edward Morin, stood as a physical representation of the new freedoms and economic opportunities that they hoped to find in their new country. And don't forget this timeline. We'll be talking about these things as we go through. You might need to refer back to it for your assignment this week. As cities grew, they weren't able to cope with this rapid influx of workers. You can see here, as these panels illustrate, the population of the United States grew rapidly in the late 1800s. And you can see that in this slide, slide A. Much of this new growth took place in urban areas defined by the census as 2,500 people or more. And this urban population, particularly that of major cities, which you can see in the image B here, dealt with challenges and opportunities that were unknown in previous generations. So you can see that in 1860, New York's population was 1.1 million. In 1900, 3.4 million people. Also, Philadelphia is another one I'd like to call your attention to. In 1860, it was at 565,000, but in 1900, 1.2 million. These places saw rapid growth. And I think this picture is neat. It's in your book, and you can also see it here, but this photo shows newly arrived immigrants at Ellis Island in New York. Inspectors are examining them for contagious health problems, which could require them to be sent back. Another thing that's interesting about Ellis Island is you can find those documents now online. So if you know that you have immigrants in your history, your family history, you can look back, and if they came through Ellis Island, there's a registry of them. I know one of the classes that we had at ASUTR several years ago was the gangster history of Hot Springs, and it focused on gangster Oni Madden, who moved to Hot Springs from New York. And Oni Madden and his brother and sister traveled alone from their home in England to the United States, and we were able to find that record of his ship passage in Ellis Island. It's really cool. So take a look around, just Google search Ellis Island registry, and it should show up. For both African Americans migrating from the post-war South and immigrants arriving from southeastern Europe, a combination of push and pull factors influenced their migration to America's urban centers. African Americans moved away from the racial violence and limited opportunities that existed in the rural South, and they were seeking wages and steady work, as well as opportunity to vote safely as free men. However, they quickly learned that racial discrimination and violence were not limited to the South. For European immigrants, famine and persecution led them to seek a new life in the United States, where, the story said, the streets were paved in gold. Of course, in northeastern and midwestern cities, both groups found a more challenging welcome than they had anticipated. City residents blamed recent arrivals for the ills of their cities, from overcrowding to rising crime. Activist groups pushed for anti-immigration legislation, seeking to limit the waves of immigrants that sought a better future in the United States. African American men who moved north as part of the Great Migration were often consigned to menial employment. This picture A shows them working as porters on the railways. And you can see in picture B the Pullman car, which is one of these work situations that many African Americans would have worked in, the Pullman dining and sleeping cars. We talked about Pullman in the last chapter. And something else to think about when we talk about having a sudden influx of people, they have to have transportation. So trolleys were one way that provided mass transportation for these people in these cities. Trolleys were more efficient than horse-drawn carriages, but big cities like New York experienced frequent accidents with them, as depicted in this 1895 illustration from Leslie's Weekly. To avoid overcrowded streets, trolleys soon went underground, as the Public Gardens portal in Boston, which is in picture B here, where 3 different lines met to enter the Tremont Street subway, the oldest subway tunnel in the United States, that opened September 1st, 1897. Now, so Boston has the oldest subway, but by far not the biggest. That would go to New York City. And in photographs such as Bandit's Roost, this photograph, now this is not a painting, but a photograph taken in 1888 on Mulberry Street in the famous Five Points neighborhood of Manhattan's Lower East Side, Jacob Riis documented the plight of New York City slums in the late 19th century. So now with photographs, we're starting to see something different. We're actually able to share images of real life, which is going to be important in terms of getting people on board with the idea of reform. Living conditions for the working class were terrible. They had tight living quarters and inadequate plumbing and sanitation, and those problems led to widespread illnesses. And here's another piece of art, The Cliff Dwellers by George Wesley Bellows, depicts urban life as he realistically saw it. Churches, civic organizations, and the secular settlement house movement all sought to provide some sort of relief to the urban working class, but conditions remained brutal for many city dwellers. Jane Addams opened the Hull House in Chicago in 1889. That's what's pictured here on this slide, and it offered services to help support the city's working poor. We see this big humanitarian effort develop to help people who are working but still remaining in the lower class and hard to provide for their families, and who have really bad living conditions. People like Jane Addams were trying to help improve those conditions. The burgeoning cities brought together both rich and poor, working class and upper class. However, the realities of urban dwellers' lives varied dramatically based on where they fell in that social chain. Entertainment and leisure time activities were heavily dependent on one's status and wealth. Obviously, the more money you have, the more you can afford to do. For the working poor, amusement parks and baseball games offered inexpensive entertainment and a brief break from the squalor of the whole situation of living in this urban setting. For the emerging middle class of salaried professionals, an escape to the suburbs kept them removed from the city's chaos outside of working hours, so suburb living develops in this time period. And as for the wealthy, immersion in the arts and culture, as well as inclusion in the social register, allowed them to socialize exclusively with those that they felt shared their same social status. And here in these pictures, this is a photograph of Jack London, who was a writer. He wrote Call of the Wild, and I wanted to include that here because there's a new movie out by the same name with the computer animated dog that's, is it called CGI? Anyway, we're debating on whether to go see that movie or not ourselves, but kind of leaning toward it now. So Jack London wrote Call of the Wild, and it shows the dogs in the brutal environment of the Klondike. And the book tells the story of a dog named Buck who was living happily in California until he's sold to be a sled dog in Canada. There he goes from living this nice life in California to surviving the harsh terrain and brutal behavior of the life of a sled dog. But ultimately, his innate animal nature takes over and he prevails. The story clarifies the struggle between humanity's nature versus the nurturing forces of society. And this amusement park, the Dreamland Amusement Park at Coney Island, is one of the ways that the city's poor or working poor would have found a way to spend some of their leisure time. Baseball, as we've already mentioned, was another way that people of the working class or the poor spent their time. Boston's Fenway Park opened in 1912 and was a popular site for working class Bostonians to spend their leisure time. The Green Monster, the iconic left field wall, makes it one of the most recognizable stadiums in baseball today. The City Beautiful movement benefited all city dwellers with its emphasis on public green spaces and more beautiful and practical city boulevards. In all, these different opportunities for leisure and pleasure made city life manageable for those citizens who lived there. And this image, this blueprint, shows Burnham's vision for Chicago, an example of the City Beautiful movement. His goal was to preserve as much green space as possible along the city's lakefront to ensure that all city dwellers had access to green space. I don't know if any of you guys will remember this or not, but a few years ago there was an attempt to bring gardening to New York City. So there were grants that they were making possible for rooftop gardens, and they might tear down a city building that had to be demolished for safety reasons, and they plant grass there and just turn it into a green place. It wasn't necessarily a park, there wasn't a lot of playground, just benches and grass and a tree or two. And here's an editorial cartoon. It's one of my favorites. This political cartoon depicts the control of Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall over the election process in New York. Another thing that's developing among the population at this time is the idea of the middle class family and separation of gender spheres. So these gender spheres had first emerged during the market revolution of the antebellum years. Whereas the husband earned money for the family outside the home, the wife oversaw the domestic chores and raised the children of the family, tended to the family's spiritual, social, and cultural needs. The magazine Good Housekeeping was launched in 1885, and it really capitalized on this urge by the middle class to focus on women maintaining a pride-worthy home. And part of this middle class pride extended into education as well. And colleges became more and more important at this time. So this is a drawing of Kansas State University in 1878. It shows the early land-grant college created by the Morrill Act. These newly created schools allowed many more students to attend college than the elite Ivy League school system, and they focused more on preparing them for professional careers in business, medicine, and law, as well as business and agriculture and other trades. And Kansas State University was an agriculture school. And I think it's also interesting that long before there were skyscrapers, we had the ability to build them, but no one did. And why do you think that is? Well, skyscrapers are super tall, and that's a lot of stair climbing. They just weren't practical buildings. So it wasn't until the invention of the electric elevator in 1889 that skyscrapers became in vogue. You know, at this point, now they're popular because you don't have to climb all the stairs to get to them. And this is a picture of the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, which is considered to be the first modern skyscraper. And on this last slide, there are just a few terms that you should know. Most of these we've gone over in the slides. A couple of them we did not, such as machine politics. That's the idea that a political machine was in control. So this machine would be a local group of people, sometimes a family, sometimes just an elite group of people who would try to meet the needs of the people that they served. And naturalism is a theory of realism that states that the laws of nature and the laws of the world are the only relevant laws governing humanity. So That wraps up chapter 19. It's a quick chapter because we've already studied the industry, the industrial revolution that's led up to this rapid growth. This chapter really focuses on rapid growth and the consequences of it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to shoot me an email.